The Supreme Court making several sweeping rulings impacting major aspects of college education. We'll speak with an expert on the fallout from the rulings and the viability of future legal challenges. Hello and welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm Jamie DeLine in Albany. Several big decisions from the Supreme Court are now impacting colleges and students across the nation. The Supreme Court striking down affirmative action in college admissions last week. The 6-3 decision means colleges won't be able to consider race when reviewing new student applications. The court also striking down the Biden administration's student loan forgiveness program. The plan would have canceled at least $10,000 of debt from qualified borrowers. Joining us now to give us additional insight on how these rulings will impact colleges across New York, we're joined by legal scholar and professor at Albany Law School, Vincent Von Bentry. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it, Professor.
Good to be with you, Jamie.
Now, Professor, I know that there were 3 rulings from the Supreme Court recently, 2 involving either college students or college graduates. First, we start with the ruling on affirmative action. What is that for people that don't know?
Well, that really is the ruling of all of them that's going to have a large impact in New York, because this is not one of those decisions such as the abortion decision last year. So last year, the Supreme Court said that the federal Constitution does not protect a woman's right to choose. New York, however, could protect the right to choose under its own law, under its own state constitution. With regard to affirmative action, the United States Supreme Court said that racial preferences, any distinctions on the basis of race, by government or government subsidized program violates the federal Constitution. So New York cannot say, well, under our laws, we allow racial preferences. Under our laws, in order to ensure diversity, right, we are going to take a look at race, consider that a factor. New York can't do that anymore because the Supreme Court said that violates the equal protection guarantee of the United States Constitution. So we're bound by that decision.
Is there a way that you think college campuses are somehow going to try to get around that in any way?
Well, if colleges and universities in New York try to get around it in a way that's too obvious, I don't think the Supreme Court majority is going to allow that. On the other hand, and as Chief Justice Roberts said in his majority opinion, he said, although racial preferences may not be used, that does not mean that a college or university cannot consider, right, the challenges that an individual student has faced, the extent to which that individual student has shown courage and persistence, other skills and abilities despite a hardship background. That can be considered. Let me tell you another thing, which I think is very important. The case was Students for Fair Admissions. Okay, it has nothing to do with fair admissions because they're not challenging, for example, wealthy students who get into a college and university because their parents give money. They're not challenging students who get into a college and university because their parents went there. They're not considering students who get in for other non-academic reasons like geography. Let's take geography. That, I think, is an important one which colleges and universities in New York and elsewhere can use. So for the purposes of diversity, a college and a university can say, we don't only want to accept students primarily who come from the suburbs. We'd like diversity of geography, which is perfectly permissible. So as you understand, I'm sure, if you are a student applying to an elite college and university and you come from Long Island, right, where there's a lot of professional parents with students who went to very excellent high schools And there's so much competition among those students. So what happens is a lot of the colleges and universities, they'll say, well, we don't only want to take students or too many students from Long Island or New York City or other the suburbs of other major metropolitan areas. So for example, we'd like to have a student from North Carolina. We'd like to have a student from Wyoming. What about we'd like to have some students from urban centers? And by doing that, they probably can increase the amount of racial and socioeconomic diversity almost as well, if not just as well, as using racial preferences.
Now, I know another Supreme Court case talked about student loans. Can you talk about that case and how this is going to impact millions of Americans?
Well, what it means is that, students and graduates who otherwise would have had $10,000 or $20,000 relieved from their student debt, they're not going to get that relief now. They won't get it, which means that they'll have more debt, they'll have less money to spend. Now, that case, as opposed to the affirmative action case, that case is only about what the federal government can do and cannot do. That case does not restrict what New York State can do. So New York State can certainly expand its programs, increase its programs to reduce the cost of going to college or a university. It can increase its programs to help reduce student debt. The Supreme Court didn't say anything, and it doesn't have any authority to tell New York, you can't help students and graduates with student debt. So New York actually can do something about that if New York has the political will.
But let's say New York doesn't do something on a federal level. It's up to Congress to try to pass legislation, correct?
You're absolutely right. So the Supreme Court did not say that the federal government could not help to relieve student loan debt. What it said was Congress must do this. It can't be the Department of Education. The program, which would have relieved $430 billion of student debt, the Supreme Court majority said that's such a vast political and economic program that we don't want a department of the executive branch doing that. We want that done through legislation. And you know how legislation has to be enacted. It's got to go through Congress, and then it's got to be signed by the president. So that's what the Supreme Court said. Congress has the authority to do it, not the Department of Education.
So I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens, right?
Absolutely, yeah. One other thing that I think is really important for New Yorkers is to understand that, we have this 6-3 conservative Republican majority on the court. Now that may be a good thing or a bad thing. It's not necessarily my preference, but who the heck cares about that? We're talking about it's a conservative Republican majority on the court. If there were more appointees on the court by liberal Democratic presidents, all these different decisions, whether we're talking about abortion rights, gun rights, separation of church and state, affirmative action, student debt, LGBTQ rights, they all would have been decided a different way. That doesn't mean that the way the conservative majority on the court has decided them is illegitimate. No, there were good reasons. There were good legal reasons in virtually all these cases. The abortion case is another one. The decision was ridiculous, the arguments that were used. But all the other ones, these are close cases, and there were legitimate arguments on both sides. We have to understand that it depends on the composition of the court, how these cases are going to be decided. New Yorkers, like everybody else, needs to keep that in mind.
All right, Professor Bonventry, thank you so much for your time. Always good to talk to you.
Hey, it's always great to be with you, Jamie.
Thank you so much. Asylum seekers coming to New York from the southern border finding themselves without vital services. When we return, hear from an immigration law expert on the latest legal barriers migrants face as they arrive in the state. If you have a comment or story idea, let us know. You can email us at news@news10.com. You can also reach out on Twitter at WTEN. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Jamie DeLine in Albany. We're continuing to follow developing situation faced by newly arrived asylum seekers here in New York State. Migrants continue to be bused to the state from the southern border following the expiration of Title 42, as the asylum seekers await having a day in court to review their asylum claim. New York City is supposed to provide basic necessities as they cannot work for a 150-day period. Some upstate municipalities report they're not seeing health care needs met by the city, but the mayor's office has yet to comment on it. To give us additional insight on the continuing legal challenges these asylum seekers are facing, we're joined by Sienna Freeman-Tolbert, a lawyer with Whiteman, Osterman, and Hannah. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
I'm happy to be here.
So for people that don't know, what is the current status of the crisis here in New York?
So what we're seeing right now, funny enough, is the reduction at the southern border. So we're not seeing as many people come through the southern border. For example, in May 2022, there was almost 7,000 people coming through daily, and now there's around 2,000 to 3,000. So we're seeing there's a reduction, but still, New York City is facing unseen issues with housing everyone. That's all the migrants coming up to the city. So they've been sending individuals up to upstate New York.
And why do you think that there's a reduction at the border?
I think a lot of the migrants are kind of waiting and seeing what's going to happen because they've seen what has been, there's been a lot of turnaround going around. People come in, they've been turned around, forced to go back to Mexico. So they're saying that a lot of people are waiting to see what's going to happen in the next few months in terms of the Biden administration's and their new policy. Also, their new policy, the Biden administration's new policy with the app to schedule your interview, it's been working. Over 30,000 people have utilized it as of this date, to my understanding. So it's been working, this new system. So we're seeing this reduction. We expect that it's just a lull and a temporary reduction and that there will be an increase in the future.
And can you tell us a little bit more about this app for people that may not know?
Sure. So individuals from any country, matter of fact, can download the government app and they can schedule their interview at the border. And so when they get to the border, they have a set time and place to go in for their interview. The interview that they're doing is called a credible fear interview. Basically, an asylum officer listens to their story to determine whether or not they have a credible fear of returning to their home country. If they do, then they get to enter the country and apply for asylum.
Now, I know you mentioned this a little bit, but here in New York State, housing is an issue. I know during the legislative session, people were thinking about housing some of the migrants in upstate New York college campuses, and Republicans were against that here in the state. What are your thoughts on that, and where do things stand?
Well, right now, what we're hearing, it's a lot of the nonprofit organizations that are really on the ground dealing with this right now. And the big issue they're saying, the migrants coming from New York City to upstate New York, Albany area, Capital Region area, is the communication. When will these migrants arrive so we can plan accordingly? Other than that, all the nonprofits in this area, we have a strong refugee resettlement program here. And so they have a lot of the tools to do a lot of the things we need to resettle individuals. So we've been seeing a lot of communication among the nonprofits and the attorneys in the area trying to just kind of come together to deal with this issue. However, in terms of housing, it's been positive for the most part because it's giving government funding to a lot of places that would have been vacant otherwise, or did not have anybody staying there. So you see hotels that may not have full capacity, now they have full capacity and they're getting funding. So for the economy, it's not necessarily a negative thing for these small business owners, what's happening. But, you know, obviously there's this stereotype, or there's these issues that come along with having migrants in your place, whether or not people will have a bias against you. So that's the concern right now that we're talking about, is pushing back against these biases.
And I know, too, state leaders have been saying that they want to waive the time period it could take for someone to be able to work here in New York. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, so typically what happens when you apply for asylum, you're eligible for employment authorization. However, the regulations require that you wait at least 150 days before you apply, and the agency must wait 180 days before they issue a work permit. So that's the problem, right? It's that 6-month period where individuals are waiting for their work permit. And so the state is trying to see if there's a way that the agency can move that a little bit, expedite. And I'm sure that's something that the federal agency is thinking about, but it's going to be very hard for them to implement because as an immigration attorney now, it's already backlogged. And so I don't know how they'll be able realistically to implement it. But if they are able to get these work authorizations to these individuals faster, then they'll start making money. They'll start contributing to the economy. And a lot of people will stop seeing them as such a burden, but more of an asset to our community.
Do you think that the federal government needs to do more?
Yes, I think there's a lot the federal government could do. For example, like we just spoke about, they could expedite those work authorizations for the migrant workers who have filed for asylum. Right now, they are trying to provide legal assistance to the migrants so that they have that assistance so they can file their application in a timely fashion. But it's been a stress, especially in Capital Region. There's a limited amount of immigration attorneys. So we're all trying to see how we can provide assistance to individuals in a timely, fair, efficient way.
How do you think the state overall has been handling this?
I think there's been a positive response. I think there could be more communication between the city and upstate New York, and when you're moving people upstate New York, I think there needs to be more coordination. And I think that's what I keep hearing from the nonprofits and with their frustration with resettlement is that there's not enough communication between various parties.
What do you think New Yorkers need to know that maybe they don't or they just don't understand?
I think what's so important to understand is that migrants that have made it through the southern border, if they came through the inspection and the credible fear interview, then they have been found to have a credible fear of returning to their home country. This means that they are legally obligated to apply for asylum. And so they have a legal right to be here in the US, and they will receive authorization to work, and they will go through all the different processes and procedures to determine whether or not they get asylum. So they're in their process. They are not, as people like to say, illegal. I think that's a misconception. They are in the process to determine whether or not they get to return to the US because they have a credible fear of returning. And they will get work authorization, and they will pay taxes, and they will contribute to our economy, wherever they're at.
Is there anything else that you would like to say about this issue?
I'd just like to say that I think that it's important that they understand these individuals are coming up from various countries, are fleeing. Usually it could be global economic migration. It could be for climate reasons. It's hot here in the US. Imagine how hot it is down there. So there's a lot of different things that people are fleeing from, and I think everyone has a right to come to the US and make that claim for asylum and say they're afraid of returning to their home country. And I think we have to respect that right.
Well, Sienna, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate having you on. Thank you so much. A lawsuit alleges the federal government censored conservative voices on social media. When we return, a breakdown of what they're alleging and the support the suit is getting from the court. If you have a comment or story idea, let us know. You can email us at news@news10.com. You can also reach out on Twitter at WTEN. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Jamie DeLine in Albany. The federal government is blocking the Biden administration from communicating with big social media companies. That block is a part of an ongoing lawsuit over actions the government allegedly took during the height of the pandemic on social media. The claim is that members of the Biden administration purposely suppressed conservative-leaning free speech on social media in posts connected to issues including the efficiency of masks, COVID-19, lockdowns, and vaccines. So far, a federal judge has concluded there is substantial evidence to support the claims.
I don't believe they're saying social media companies don't have a right to moderate their content. It really seems to be, is the government becoming too involved? And I think that's really the heart of the lawsuit.
Stay with us and we'll be back with a look ahead in just a moment. Finally, on Empire State Weekly, much of the state is experiencing high temperatures, with some areas issuing heat advisories. With the high heat, doctors are stressing the importance of staying hydrated and knowing the signs of a heat-related illness. However, as summer continues, not all have access to the same resources, which could put some individuals at risk. Next week, we'll look into a statewide resource available to help the homeless population stay safe during this hot summer heat. From all of us here on Empire State Weekly, I'm Jamie DeLine in Albany. We'll see you next week. And don't forget, you can watch Empire State Weekly all over New York State. Here's a full schedule of Empire State Weekly on 10 television stations across New York.